Thomas Hale's boot struck the frozen creek when the mare slammed against his leg. Cold muscle. Dead weight. Her reins tangled tight around his wrist. Ice cracked under both of them. The mare trembled hard, breath rattling thin in the gray spring thaw. Thomas braced his shoulder against her neck and hauled. Leather groaned. Water rushed beneath the ice. Then his hand hit the saddle skirt. Burned iron scarred the leather deep. A ranch brand. Thomas froze. Because that brand belonged to Jacob Mercer. And Jacob Mercer had been buried 3 winters ago. Which meant only one person could claim this mare now. Mercer's young widow. Thomas Hale's boot broke through the crust of creek ice with a sharp crack that echoed up the empty valley. Cold water surged around his heel. The mare slammed against his leg again, ribs shuddering beneath a coat stiff with frost. Her reins twisted tight around his wrist. For a moment the creek tried to drag them both down. Thomas braced his shoulder against her neck and shoved. Ice plates groaned and slid across each other. The mare staggered forward 1 step. Then another. Water spilled from her legs in dull splashes as she clawed onto the muddy bank. Thomas stood there breathing hard while the thaw wind whispered through the cottonwoods. The mare trembled beside him. Steam drifted weakly from her nostrils. He rubbed a gloved hand down her neck, feeling the cold lock deep in the muscle. "Easy now." The words came out rough. He was not used to speaking much these days. The mare shifted and the saddle leather creaked softly. Thomas glanced down. The saddle skirt brushed his glove. Burned iron scarred the leather in a hard black shape. A ranch brand. He knew that mark. Everyone in 3 counties knew it. The Mercer spread ran 10 miles west of the ridge. Thomas had ridden past the place often enough. But Jacob Mercer would not be waiting there. Jacob Mercer had been buried 3 winters ago beneath frozen prairie ground. Thomas ran his thumb over the brand again. The leather was old. The mark deep. Whoever rode this mare had not bothered hiding the brand. Which meant the horse had come home alone. The mare nudged his coat pocket weakly. Thomas sighed. The sound drifted out over the creek where broken ice clicked softly against the stones. "Fine," he muttered. He took the reins. The mare followed slowly, hooves squelching through thawing mud. The ride west took most of the afternoon. Clouds dragged low across the sky. Wind rattled the dry grass along the hills. Thomas said nothing. The mare walked beside his horse with patient steps. Near dusk the Mercer ranch came into view. A small cabin crouched against the wind. Smoke barely lifted from the crooked chimney. The barn doors leaned crooked on their hinges. Thomas swung down from the saddle. His boots thudded dull against the frozen yard. The mare stopped beside him. The saddle leather creaked again. Thomas walked up the porch steps. The boards groaned under his weight. He knocked once. The sound echoed through the quiet house. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the door opened slowly. A young woman stood in the narrow doorway. Her dark hair hung loose around tired eyes. Sarah Mercer looked past Thomas. Her gaze fell on the mare. The breath left her in a quiet gasp. And for the first time that day, Thomas Hale understood why the horse had come home. The mare's hooves knocked softly against the porch post. Dull. Unsteady. Thomas Hale stood beside the rail while the wind slid across the yard in long, thin sighs. Sarah Mercer stepped down from the doorway slowly. Her boots pressed into the half-frozen mud. She moved toward the horse like someone approaching a ghost. "Mercy." The word left her lips barely louder than the breeze. Her hand reached for the mare's cheek. The horse leaned into her palm. Leather creaked as the saddle shifted. Sarah's fingers trembled across the old brand burned into the skirt. Thomas watched her shoulders tighten. "She came home," Sarah whispered. Thomas nodded once. "Creek nearly took her." Sarah looked up then. Her eyes studied him the way folks studied strangers on empty roads. "You pulled her out." Thomas shrugged. The porch door banged softly behind them as the wind caught it. The sound echoed through the quiet yard. Sarah wiped her sleeve across her eyes. She'll freeze if she stays out here. Thomas already had the reins in hand. Barn. The barn doors groaned when he dragged them open. Rust scraped against old wood. Inside, the air smelled of hay and damp earth. Warmer than the wind outside. The mare stepped carefully across the threshold. Her hooves thudded dull against the packed floor. Thomas pulled the saddle loose. Buckles clanked. Leather slid away stiff with frost. Sarah hung a lantern on a nail. Flame flickered weak orange against the beams. Warm light. Cold shadows. Thomas rubbed the mare down with rough burlap. Steam rose slowly from the horse's back. "She hasn't eaten proper in days," Sarah said. Thomas nodded toward a haystack. "Feed her slow." The mare chewed with soft tearing sounds. Life returning one mouthful at a time. The barn settled into quiet. Wood popped in the rafters. Wind pressed against the walls. Thomas stepped outside again. The cold returned instantly. It crawled up through the soles of his boots. He glanced toward the pasture. The fences sagged in 3 places. Gate hanging crooked. Winter had not been kind here. Behind him the barn door creaked open again. Sarah stepped out carrying a bucket. Water sloshed against the tin sides. "You don't have to stay," she said. Thomas watched the gray sky darken above the hills. "Mare won't make the night if she chills again." Sarah followed his gaze. "You mean to camp out here?" Thomas shrugged. "Done worse." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the dead grass. Somewhere far off a crow gave a dry, cracking call. Sarah studied the yard. The broken fence. The empty corral. Then she spoke quietly. "You can come inside." Thomas said nothing. "Just for the night," she added. The stove still warm. The door creaked open when they stepped into the cabin. Warmth rolled over them slow and steady. Wood smoke. Stew simmering faint in an iron pot. The fire popped softly in the cast stove. Thomas stood near the door. Boots dripping thaw water onto the floorboards. Sarah hung the lantern on a wall hook. Light filled the small room. 1 table. 2 chairs. A narrow bed tucked beside the wall. An empty chair sat opposite the stove. Dust lay thick across its seat. Thomas noticed. Sarah noticed him noticing. She moved past it quickly. "Sit," she said. Thomas lowered himself slowly. The chair legs scraped against the plank floor. Sarah poured coffee into a chipped tin cup. Steam rose in pale curls. Thomas wrapped his hands around it. Warmth seeped into his fingers. The silence settled again. Only the fire talking. Only the spoon clinking softly against the pot. "You knew Jacob," Sarah said after a while. Thomas nodded. "Rode fence once or twice." Sarah stared into the stove. "He was riding the South Range when the storm came." Her voice thinned. "They found his coat by the ravine." Thomas said nothing. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin shutters. The sound came sharp against the warm quiet inside. Sarah glanced toward the door. Like she expected someone riding up. Thomas followed the look. "Expecting company?" She shook her head. But the answer came slow. "No." The word hung there. Thin. Uneasy. Thomas set the cup down. The metal tapped the table softly. "Someone's been bothering this place." Sarah did not look at him. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "Men ride by sometimes." "What men?" She hesitated. Then the truth slipped out quiet. "Crowley's riders." Thomas knew the name. Silas Crowley. Land baron. Owned half the valley and wanted the rest. "What do they want?" Sarah forced a small breath. "Land." The fire popped louder. Outside, a loose shutter banged once in the wind. Thomas leaned back in the chair. The wood creaked beneath his weight. "Widow alone on a spread," he said slowly. "Easy target." Sarah said nothing, but her eyes stayed fixed on the door, as if waiting for the sound of hooves. The silence stretched. Then the mare whinnied softly from the barn. Alive. Fighting. Thomas listened to that sound. The steady rhythm of the horse shifting in straw. Something about it eased the tightness in the room. He pushed himself up from the chair. Boot heels thudded once on the floor. "I'll check the barn." Sarah nodded. He paused at the door. The cold seeped through the wood already. "You got another chair?" Sarah blinked. "What?" "For tomorrow." She looked at the empty one near the stove. The one gathering dust. Her voice came quieter now. "I suppose I do." Thomas opened the door. Cold air rushed in. But behind him the fire kept burning. And inside the cabin, for the first time in a long while, the empty chair no longer felt quite so empty. Morning crept over the Mercer ranch slow and gray. Frost still clung to the fence rails. Thomas Hale stepped out of the cabin with a tin cup in his hand. The coffee steamed in the cold air. His boots struck the yard with dull thuds. Somewhere in the barn the mare stamped once. Alive. Strong enough to complain. Thomas crossed the yard and pulled the barn door open. The hinges groaned long and low. Warm hay smell rolled out to meet him. Inside, the mare lifted her head. Straw rustled beneath her hooves. Her coat no longer carried that stiff winter chill. Thomas set the cup on a barrel and ran his hand down her neck. Heat lived there now. "Better," he muttered. The mare nudged his shoulder. Leather creaked softly from the saddle hanging over the stall rail. Thomas glanced at the brand again. Burned iron. Old. Deep. Jacob Mercer's mark. The barn door opened behind him. Sarah Mercer stepped inside carrying a feed scoop. Grain rattled against the tin pail. "You're up early." Thomas shrugged. "Habit." Sarah poured the grain into the trough. The mare lowered her head. Chewing filled the barn with steady rhythm. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Sarah leaned against the stall rail. "You didn't have to stay." Thomas watched the horse eat. Fence down on the north line. Sarah frowned. "You saw that already?" Thomas nodded. "Wind did it." Silence settled again. Outside, the thaw wind brushed through the dry grass. The sound whispered through the cracks in the barn walls. Sarah spoke softly. "You planning to ride out today?" Thomas lifted the saddle. Leather groaned as he set it across the rail. "After the fence." Sarah steadied him a moment longer. "You're fixing it?" Thomas did not answer. He simply grabbed the coil of wire hanging from a nail. Outside the air felt colder again. Clouds dragged low across the hills. Thomas drove fence posts with slow, steady blows. The hammer struck wood. Thud. 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 Each sound echoed across the empty pasture. Sarah stood near the gate holding the wire tight. Her gloves were too thin for the weather. Thomas noticed. He said nothing. The wind lifted her hair across her face. "You work like a ranch hand," she said. Thomas pulled the wire tight. "Used to." "Before what?" Thomas twisted the wire knot hard. Metal snapped tight. "Before everything." He did not say that part. The hammer rang again. The fence slowly rose back into place. By noon the sun broke weak through the clouds. Light touched the pasture in thin strips of gold. The yard looked different under that light. Less abandoned. Less tired. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow. Sarah handed him a tin cup of water. Their fingers brushed. Warm skin. Cold air. She looked away quickly. "You're staying another day," she said quietly. Thomas glanced toward the barn. "Mare needs watching." Sarah nodded. But something in her eyes said she understood the light. The quiet afternoon settled over the ranch. Wood chopped beside the cabin. The axe bit into logs with clean cracks. Inside, stew simmered again. The smell drifted through the open door. Life making small noises. Normal noises. Toward evening the wind carried another sound. Distant. Sharp. Hoofbeats. Thomas froze. The axe hung halfway through a log. Sarah stepped onto the porch. Her face tightened. "You hear that?" Thomas already had. The hoofbeats faded as quickly as they came. Riders on the road beyond the ridge. Not stopping. Not today. But close enough to remind them. The silence returned slowly. Thomas finished splitting the log. Wood fell apart with a dull snap. Sarah watched the empty road. They've been riding past all week. Thomas stacked the firewood beside the porch. Crowley's men. Sarah nodded. They keep looking over here. Thomas leaned the axe against the wall. The metal rang softly. Inside the barn the mare snorted. Thomas walked back across the yard. The barn door creaked open again. Inside, the mare stood stronger now. Her coat brushed clean. Her eyes clear. Thomas lifted the saddle once more. His thumb pressed against the burned brand. Something about it bothered him. The mark looked older than the leather. Deeper than a simple ranch brand. Sarah stepped into the barn behind him. Straw rustled beneath her boots. "What is it?" Thomas tilted the saddle toward the lantern light. "Brand's wrong." Sarah frowned. "That's Jacob's mark." Thomas ran his thumb along the edge of the scar. "Not placed for cattle." Sarah stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Thomas did not answer right away. He stared at the brand. At the way the iron had been pressed into the saddle. Not for ownership. For memory. Or warning. Outside, the wind rose again. The barn walls creaked softly. Far down the valley a dog barked once. Thomas finally set the saddle back on the rail. Nothing. Sarah didn't believe him. But she didn't press. The lantern flame flickered between them. Warm light in a cold barn. The mare shifted quietly behind them. Alive. Home. And out beyond the darkening hills, somewhere past the ridge road, men were already watching this ranch. Waiting for the thaw to finish its work. Morning sunlight pushed through the cabin window in narrow strips. Dust floated in the gold light. The stove ticked softly as the iron warmed. Sarah Mercer stirred the pot with slow circles. The spoon scraped the bottom. Steady. Quiet. Thomas Hale sat at the small table with a whetstone in one hand. Steel rasped across the knife blade. Shhht. Pause. Shhht. The sound filled the room like breathing. Outside the wind moved through the grass in long waves. Winter losing its grip. Sarah set a bowl in front of him. Steam rose thick and white. "You work a knife like a man expecting trouble," she said. Thomas shrugged. "Habit." The spoon tapped the pot again. Sarah leaned on the counter. "You staying long enough to fix the south fence too?" Thomas blew across the stew. Hot air rolled across his face. "Mare still healing." Sarah nodded slowly. "But the fences weren't." Thomas did not answer. The knife rasped again across the stone. Shhht. Shhht. A sound like patience. Outside the barn door banged once in the wind. Both of them looked toward it. The sound faded. Just the wind. But the quiet afterward felt tighter. Thomas finished sharpening the knife. The blade slid into its sheath with a soft click. "I'll check the saddle again." Sarah frowned. "You keep studying that brand." Thomas stood. Boot heels thudded softly on the wooden floor. Something wrong about it. They crossed the yard together. The ground squished under their steps. Spring mud replacing winter frost. The barn doors creaked open. Inside, warm hay smell wrapped around them. The mare lifted her head from the trough. Grain rattled softly between her teeth. Thomas lifted the saddle from the rail. Leather groaned in the quiet barn. He set it across a workbench beneath the lantern. Sarah leaned closer. The burned brand glowed dark against the worn leather. Jacob Mercer's mark. A crooked iron M inside a circle. "Looks the same as always," Sarah said. Thomas ran his thumb across the edges again. The scar felt rough. Deeper than it should. "Brand shouldn't cut this far into saddle leather," he muttered. Sarah crossed her arms. "Jacob burned it himself." Thomas glanced up. "You saw him?" Sarah nodded. "2 nights before he rode south." Her voice softened. "He said if anything happened, the ranch would still belong to me." Thomas turned the saddle slightly. Lantern light shifted across the mark. A thin seam appeared along the brand's edge. He pressed it with his thumb. The leather flexed. Not solid. Hollow. Sarah leaned closer. "What is it?" Thomas didn't answer. He pulled a small awl from his belt. The tool clicked softly against the bench. Careful pressure. The awl slipped beneath the seam. Leather lifted with a dry crackle. Sarah sucked in a breath. Inside the saddle lining something rustled faintly. Paper. Old paper. Thomas stopped. His eyes flicked toward the barn door. The wind pushed it open an inch. Wood creaked. Cold air slid inside. Sarah followed his gaze. "Just wind," she said. But her voice carried less certainty now. Thomas lowered the flap again. He didn't pull the paper free. "Not yet." "Why hide something in the saddle?" Sarah whispered. Thomas studied the brand. "Because saddles travel." Sarah's face tightened. "And Jacob rode south the night he disappeared." Thomas nodded once. He expected trouble. The mare stamped suddenly. Hoof striking wood. Hard. Both of them turned. Through the barn door gap the distant road stretched across the hills. Dust lifted in the far distance. Thin. Moving. Sarah stepped closer to the doorway. Her breath slowed. Riders. Thomas joined her. The dust cloud grew slowly larger against the horizon. Not many. 2. Maybe 3. Too far to see faces. But close enough to be coming this direction. Sarah's fingers tightened around the barn rail. Crowley's men ride that road. Thomas watched the dust for a long moment. Then he closed the barn door. The latch clicked. Quiet. Inside the lantern flame flickered. Warm light fought the cold creeping through the walls. Sarah turned back to the saddle. Whatever Jacob hid in there. Her voice trailed off. Thomas slid the awl back beneath the seam. The paper rustled again. Slowly he pulled it free. A folded sheet. Edges stiff. Stamped with old ink. Sarah stared at it like something sacred. Thomas did not open it yet. The barn settled around them. Straw shifting. The mare breathing slow and steady. Outside, faint hoofbeats drifted across the wind. Far away. But coming closer. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "If that paper proves the ranch is mine." Thomas folded the document carefully and slipped it back into the saddle lining. Leather pressed flat again. "Hidden." "For now," he said quietly. Sarah blinked. "Why hide it again?" Thomas walked to the stall and hung the saddle back on its peg. The leather creaked softly. "Because if Crowley's riders see it," he said, "they'll come faster." The hoofbeats faded again beyond the ridge. But the silence they left behind felt heavier. Sarah looked at the saddle. Then at Thomas. The thaw wind rattled the barn walls. Winter was ending. And trouble was riding closer with every mile of open road. Morning came quiet over the Mercer ranch. Thin sunlight crept across the yard. Mud glistened where frost had once held the ground hard. Thomas Hale carried a bucket from the well. The rope creaked over the pulley. Water sloshed against the tin. The mare watched from the corral. Her ears flicked forward. Alive. Strong enough now to stamp when she wanted grain. Thomas poured the bucket slowly into the trough. Water splashed dull against the wood. Behind him the cabin door opened. Sarah Mercer stepped onto the porch with a folded cloth in her hands. Steam curled from the bread she carried. Warmth drifted out from the cabin behind her. Firewood popped inside the stove. The smell of fresh bread floated across the yard. Thomas wiped his hands on his coat. Sarah smiled faintly. "You're feeding my horse before feeding yourself." Thomas shrugged. "Horse works harder." Sarah laughed once. Soft. The sound surprised both of them. It had been a long time since laughter lived in this yard. Thomas leaned against the fence rail. The wood creaked under his weight. "Fence will hold another season now." Sarah nodded. "I noticed." She broke the bread and handed him a piece. The crust cracked warm between their fingers. Thomas took a bite. The taste filled his mouth with heat. For a moment the ranch felt almost peaceful. Then the wind shifted. A new sound rolled across the valley. Hooves. Slow. Measured. Sarah froze. The bread slipped slightly in her hand. Thomas did not move. But his eyes lifted toward the ridge road. 3 riders appeared over the rise. Dust lifted behind them. Their horses walked with the loose confidence of men who believed the land belonged to them. Sarah whispered, "Crowley." Thomas kept chewing. The riders crossed the pasture line without asking. Hooves squished through thawing mud. Leather saddles creaked. Metal jingled softly. The lead rider sat tall in a black coat. Silas Crowley. Even from the yard Thomas could see the polished boots and silver spurs. A second man rode beside him with a tin star pin crooked to his vest. Deputy Rourke. The third man carried a rifle across his saddle. Crowley's gaze swept the ranch slowly. Barn. Fence. Corral. Then Sarah. His horse stopped a few feet from the porch. Mud sucked at the hooves. Crowley tipped his hat slightly. "Mrs. Mercer." Sarah straightened. Her voice held steady. "Mr. Crowley." Crowley glanced toward Thomas. "Didn't know you had hired help." Thomas leaned his elbow on the fence rail. The wood creaked again. "Didn't know you were invited." Crowley smiled thin. The deputy chuckled. The rifleman said nothing. Crowley turned back to Sarah. "Spring thaw brings new business." He reached into his coat. Paper rustled. The sound carried sharp in the quiet yard. He unfolded a document. "Your late husband held several debts, Mrs. Mercer." Sarah's jaw tightened. "That's not true." Crowley ignored the protest. "This paper says otherwise." He held the document where she could see the seal. Red wax. County stamp. Official. Cold. "Unless those debts are paid," Crowley continued, "this property transfers to my holdings." The wind brushed across the yard. Loose boards rattled on the barn. Sarah stepped down from the porch. Her boots pressed into the mud. "My husband paid his accounts." Crowley shrugged. "Records disagree." The deputy shifted in his saddle. Leather squeaked. Thomas spoke quietly. "County judge say that?" Crowley's eyes flicked toward him again. "No need for judges when contracts are clear." Thomas glanced toward the barn. The saddle with the hidden paper waited inside. Crowley's gaze followed his. Sharp. Curious. "You stable anything valuable in that barn, Mrs. Mercer?" Crowley asked. Sarah stiffened. "Just livestock." Crowley smiled again. "Good." He folded the document slowly. Paper crackling. "Because if I find property belonging to my holdings hidden here." His voice trailed off. The rifleman shifted his weapon across the saddle. Metal clicked softly. The thread hung in the air like cold fog. Thomas stepped away from the fence. Boots squelched through the mud. Crowley's horse tossed its head. "You planning to leave now?" Thomas asked. Crowley studied him. "You a friend of the widow?" Thomas shrugged. "Passing through." Crowley nodded slowly. "Then you won't mind riding on soon?" The deputy laughed again. Crowley turned his horse. But before leaving he looked once more at Sarah. 3 days. His voice dropped quiet and sharp. "Either the debt is settled." He paused. "Or the Mercer Ranch becomes Crowley land." The riders turned toward the road. Hooves thudded across the thawing pasture. Mud splashed. Leather creaked. The dust faded slowly behind them. Silence returned. Heavy. Cold. Sarah stood in the yard without moving. Her hands trembled. Thomas watched the ridge where the riders disappeared. 3 days, she whispered. The wind rattled the barn doors again. Inside that barn the saddle hung quiet on its peg. And hidden inside its lining rested the one paper that could break Crowley's claim. Thomas rubbed a hand across his jaw. Then he started walking toward the barn. Sarah looked up. "Where are you going?" Thomas didn't slow. Checking that saddle again. Because 3 days suddenly felt like a very short time to keep a secret alive. The wind rose before dawn. It slid along the cabin walls with a long hollow moan. Thomas Hale woke to the stove ticking softly beside the bed. The fire had burned low. Red coals glowed beneath the iron grate. Cold lingered in the corners of the room. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The yard smelled of wet earth and thawing grass. Mist hovered over the pasture. The barn door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, the mare shifted in the stall. Her hooves rustled the straw. Alive. Stronger now. Thomas ran a hand along her neck. Warm muscle under his palm. "You'll run again soon," he murmured. The mare snorted softly. Outside the barn a board slammed against the wind. Thomas stepped out into the gray morning. Sarah Mercer stood near the well with a bucket. Her breath rose in thin clouds. "You didn't sleep much," she said. Thomas shrugged. "Wind." She pulled the bucket from the well. The rope squealed across the pulley. Water sloshed. Cold. Heavy. Thomas took the bucket from her. Their hands brushed briefly. Warmth meeting frost. "Crowley's riders passed again last night," she said quietly. Thomas glanced toward the ridge. "You saw them?" Lanterns moving along the road. The wind carried the distant bark of a dog. Sarah lowered her voice. "They're waiting." Thomas nodded once. "They think pressure will break you." Sarah looked at the barn. "I don't scare easy." Thomas believed that. Still, he studied the empty road again. Silence hung over the valley. Too quiet. He turned back toward the corral. The mare stamped once. Grain rattled into the trough. Crunch. Crunch. Life going on. By mid-morning the sun burned through the clouds. The ranch looked almost peaceful. Fence lines straight. Smoke rising from the chimney. Thomas repaired the gate hinge with slow hammer blows. Clang. Clang. Metal rang across the yard. Sarah worked in the garden patch. Turning soil that winter had packed hard. For a while the ranch sounded like work. Normal work. Then the hammer paused. Thomas lifted his head. A shape moved near the far fence. A rider. No hurry. Just watching. Sarah noticed the silence. She looked up from the soil. The rider tipped his hat once. Then turned his horse. Gone again behind the ridge. The wind carried the fading rhythm of hooves. Sarah wiped dirt from her hands. "They keep doing that." Thomas slid the hammer into his belt. "Letting you know they're there." Sarah swallowed. "They think I'll run." Thomas tightened the hinge bolt. The metal scraped hard. Crowley likes easy land. Sarah looked toward the barn again. "You think he knows about the saddle?" Thomas shook his head. "Not yet. The word yet lingered in the air. Inside the barn the mare whinnied softly. Thomas walked over to check her. The saddle hung where he had left it. Leather dark in the dim light. He touched the lining where the hidden paper rested. Still there. Still safe. But the walls of the barn suddenly felt thinner. Like secrets had begun to leak through the cracks. Outside the yard grew quieter again. Too quiet. The afternoon passed slow. Wood chopped. Soup simmered. Wind rattled the shutters once or twice. But toward evening a new sound arrived. Hooves. Closer this time. Not on the road. In the pasture. Thomas stepped out of the cabin. Sarah followed. 2 riders crossed the lower fence. Not Crowley himself. His men. The deputy rode with them. Tin Star catching the fading light. They stopped near the corral. The mare lifted her head sharply. Thomas walked forward slowly. Mud sucked at his boots. The deputy spoke first. "Evening." His voice carried lazy confidence. Thomas said nothing. The rifleman nodded toward the corral. "Fine-looking horse." Sarah stiffened beside the porch. "That horse belongs here." The deputy leaned forward in the saddle. "Everything here belongs to Mr. Crowley soon." Thomas folded his arms across his chest. "You got papers for that?" The deputy smiled crooked. "Soon." The rifleman nudged his horse closer to the fence. The mare backed deeper into the corral. Hooves thudding against the rail. Thomas took a step forward. "Horse stays." The deputy studied him carefully. "You planning to make trouble, cowboy?" Thomas's voice stayed quiet. "No." The rifleman chuckled. "Shame." For a long moment nobody moved. Wind brushed across the pasture. Dry grass hissed. Then the deputy tipped his hat. "We're just looking around." His horse turned slowly. The riders moved back toward the broken fence line. Before leaving, the deputy glanced once more at the barn. Eyes lingering. Searching. Then they rode off. Hooves faded across the valley. Silence returned again. Heavy. Sarah stepped off the porch. Her hands trembled. "They're getting bolder." Thomas watched the road until the dust vanished. "They're measuring." "Measuring what?" Thomas glanced toward the barn. "How much fight lives on this ranch?" The sun dropped behind the hills. Cold crept back across the yard. Inside the barn the mare shifted restlessly. The saddle hung quiet against the wall. And somewhere out in the valley, Crowley's men were already planning how to take everything Sarah Mercer had left. The wind died sometime before dawn. Silence settled over the Mercer ranch. Heavy. Waiting. Thomas Hale stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee warming his hands. The sunrise crept across the pasture in thin bands of gold. Frost glittered along the fence wire. The thaw had paused in the night. Cold returned. Inside the barn the mare stamped once. The sound echoed through the still air. Thomas listened. The horse sounded stronger each morning. He took a slow drink from the cup. Warm coffee. Cold morning. Behind him the cabin door creaked open. Sarah Mercer wrapped a shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You're up early again." Thomas shrugged. "Quiet woke me." Sarah looked across the pasture. Her eyes searched the ridge. "Too quiet." Thomas nodded once. That was the trouble with valleys like this. Sound carried far. When nothing moved, the silence itself began to feel like a warning. The mare whinnied again from the barn. Thomas set the cup down on the rail. "Feed time." They crossed the yard together. Their boots crunched lightly through frozen mud. The barn door groaned when Thomas pulled it open. Warm hay scent rolled out to meet them. The mare lifted her head. Her ears flicked forward. Thomas poured grain into the trough. Metal clanged softly against wood. Crunch. Crunch. The horse ate with steady rhythm. Sarah leaned against the stall rail. She's almost ready to run again. Thomas ran his hand down the mare's neck. Muscle firm beneath the coat now. Another day or two. Sarah smiled faintly. She might save this ranch yet. Thomas said nothing, but his eyes drifted to the saddle hanging on the peg. The brand still hidden. The paper still folded beneath the lining. The secret still alive. Outside a crow cried suddenly. Sharp. Harsh. Both of them turned. The barn door stood half open. Wind pushed through the gap. And with it came another sound. Hooves. Many. Thomas stepped into the doorway. Dust rose beyond the lower fence. Not 2 riders. Not 3. 5. They rode straight toward the ranch. Sarah's breath caught. Crowley. Thomas did not answer. He counted them carefully. Crowley himself rode in front. Black coat again. Silver spurs catching the sun. The deputy rode beside him. 2 riflemen behind. Another rider dragging a rope coil across his saddle. Thomas stepped into the yard. Boots sank slightly in the thawing mud. Sarah followed but stayed near the porch. The riders slowed when they reached the corral. Hooves thudded softly. Leather creaked. Crowley looked pleased. Well now. His gaze drifted across the ranch. Still standing, I see. Thomas folded his arms. Crowley's eyes slid toward the barn. Then the corral. Then the mare. Recognition flickered there. That horse, Crowley said slowly. Looks like Mercer's stock. Sarah stepped forward. She is. Crowley leaned in his saddle. Funny thing. He pointed lazily with a gloved finger. Mercer property transferred to me after his death. Thomas spoke quietly. Paper say that? Crowley smiled. Soon enough. The rope man slid down from his horse. Boots thudded against the ground. He walked toward the corral gate. Sarah's voice snapped sharp. Don't. The man ignored her. His hand reached for the latch. The mare backed away. Hooves clattered against the rails. Thomas moved. 1 step. Then another. He stopped between the man and the gate. The rope man paused. Crowley watched the moment unfold. You planning to block lawful property seizure? Crowley asked lightly. Thomas's voice stayed low. Horse stays. The rope man laughed once. You serious? His hand pushed toward the latch again. Thomas grabbed his wrist. Quick. Hard. Leather creaked. The rope dropped to the ground. For a moment the yard went perfectly still. Crowley's smile faded. The deputy shifted in the saddle. Hand resting near his revolver. Sarah's heart seemed loud enough to hear. Crowley finally sighed. Well. He tipped his hat slightly. I did warn you this might turn unpleasant. The rope man pulled his arm free and stepped back. Crowley gestured toward the barn. Check inside. One of the riflemen slid down from his horse. Boots splashed through the mud. He started walking toward the barn door. Sarah's voice trembled. Stay out of there. Thomas stepped sideways, blocking the path. The rifleman stopped. Crowley steadied Thomas carefully. You really just passing through? Thomas looked him in the eye. Was. Crowley nodded slowly. Then he laughed. Short. Cold. 3 days I gave you, Mrs. Mercer. His gaze flicked toward the barn again. Looks like you found a cowboy to fight your battles. The rifleman climbed back into the saddle. Crowley turned his horse toward the road. But before leaving he looked once more at Thomas. You're making this personal. Thomas did not answer. Crowley's voice hardened. Next time I ride here. His horse snorted beneath him. I won't bother talking first. The riders wheeled their horses around. Hooves thundered briefly across the pasture. Dust rose behind them again. The sound faded slowly into the valley. Silence returned. But it felt different now. Tighter. Colder. Sarah exhaled shakily. They almost took her. Thomas watched the empty road. Next time they'll try harder. Inside the barn the mare stamped once. Strong. Alive. The saddle creaked softly on its peg. And hidden inside it lay the paper Crowley feared more than any rifle. Night settled heavy over the Mercer ranch. The wind had dropped. Cold crept across the ground again, sealing the mud into stiff ridges. Inside the cabin the stove glowed bright. Fire cracked softly. Thomas Hale sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Metal clicked. Cloth slid across the barrel. Slow. Careful. Across from him Sarah Mercer folded blankets with quiet hands. The cabin felt warm. But the silence outside pressed against the walls. Waiting. Thomas set the rifle down. You should sleep. Sarah shook her head. I won't while they're riding out there. Thomas listened. The valley carried distant sound tonight. Wind moving through grass. The far cry of a coyote. Then something else. Hooves. Slow. Measured. Sarah froze. There. Thomas stood. The chair scraped softly across the floor. He stepped onto the porch. Cold air struck his face. Across the dark pasture lantern light bobbed along the road. Not one. Several. Thomas counted them. 6 riders this time. Crowley had come back. Behind him the cabin door opened quietly. Sarah stepped out beside him. They're early. Thomas's voice stayed low. They're finished waiting. The lanterns drifted closer. Hoofbeats thickened in the frozen ground. The sound rolled across the yard like distant thunder. Thomas walked toward the barn. Sarah followed. The barn doors groaned when he pulled them open. Inside, the mare lifted her head sharply. Straw rustled. Thomas grabbed the saddle from the peg. Leather creaked. He slid the hidden paper from the lining. Folded it once. Tucked it into his coat. Sarah watched him. You're taking it out there? Thomas nodded. Crowley won't stop until he sees proof. Outside the hoofbeats reached the lower pasture. Lantern light flickered across the fence posts. Thomas grabbed the rifle leaning against the barn wall. Metal clicked when he worked the bolt. Sarah stepped closer. You don't have to do this. Thomas looked at the mare. The horse snorted softly. Alive. Home. He looked back at Sarah. Someone does. They stepped into the yard together. Lanterns swayed as the riders approached the gate. Crowley rode in front again. Black coat. Silver spurs. His horse stopped just short of the porch. Hooves crushed frost under iron shoes. Crowley smiled in the lantern glow. Evening again. Thomas stood in the center of the yard. Rifle resting across his arms. Sarah remained behind him near the porch. Crowley glanced at the rifle. Now that looks unfriendly. Thomas's voice stayed steady. You crossed the fence. Crowley gestured toward the deputy. Law's with me. The deputy lifted a folded paper. Lantern light glinted on the county seal. Eviction order, he called. Sarah's breath caught. Crowley's smile widened. You had your chance. Thomas reached into his coat slowly. Crowley's riders tensed. Rifles shifted in saddles. Thomas pulled the folded paper free. The hidden document. He held it toward the lantern light. You might want to read this first. Crowley's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to be? Thomas tossed the paper toward him. It landed in the mud beside the horse. Crowley leaned down. Picked it up. The paper crackled open. Lantern light slid across old ink and official stamps. His smile faded. Slowly. Thomas spoke quietly. Jacob Mercer recorded the deed before he rode south. Crowley's jaw tightened. The deputy leaned closer in his saddle. What is it? Crowley did not answer right away. The riders shifted uneasily. Lantern flames flickered in the wind. Finally Crowley folded the paper again. Carefully. Too carefully. That document means nothing. Thomas lifted the rifle slightly. The metal clicked. It means this ranch belongs to Sarah Mercer. The deputy frowned. Let me see it. Crowley kept the paper tight in his fist. His eyes burned at Thomas. You think waving a scrap of paper changes anything? Thomas took one slow step forward. Boots crunching frost. It changes the law. The deputy slid from his saddle. Mud sucked at his boots. Hand it here, he said to Crowley. Crowley hesitated. That moment stretched. Tight. Dangerous. Thomas saw the shift in the rifleman's shoulders. The tightening hands. The breath before violence. Crowley suddenly shoved the paper back into his coat. Enough of this. He jerked his chin toward the barn. Take the horse. The rifleman swung down instantly. Boots slammed the ground. Thomas raised the rifle. The bolt snapped back. The sound cut the night sharp as lightning. Next step stops here. Silence crashed over the yard. The rifleman froze. Crowley's horse snorted nervously. Lantern flames flickered in the wind. Sarah stood behind Thomas. Hands clenched tight. Crowley studied the rifle barrel. Then Thomas's eyes. The cold in them. The promise there. Finally Crowley exhaled slowly. You're making a grave mistake. Thomas did not blink. Ride. The deputy looked uncertain now. Crowley. Crowley swung his horse around hard. Mud sprayed. Mount up. One by one the riders climbed back into their saddles. Lanterns swayed again. Crowley leaned forward one last time. This isn't finished. Thomas lowered the rifle slightly. It is tonight. Crowley spat into the mud. Then the riders turned toward the road. Hooves thundered across the frozen pasture. Lanterns bobbed into the darkness. The sound faded slowly down the valley. Silence returned. Cold. Deep. Thomas lowered the rifle. Sarah stepped beside him. Her voice barely a whisper. You stood your ground. Thomas watched the empty road. Inside the barn the mare whinnied softly. Alive. Still here. For now. Morning came slow after the long night. Frost clung to the fence wire again. The thaw had paused once more. Cold crept through the Mercer yard like a reminder that winter had not fully let go. Thomas Hale stood near the corral rail with a tin cup warming his hands. Coffee steamed in the pale light. Across the pasture the road lay empty. But the silence still carried Crowley's promise. This isn't finished. The mare snorted softly behind him. Hooves rustled through straw. Alive. Sarah Mercer stepped onto the porch. The door creaked behind her. You stayed awake. Thomas shrugged. Riders didn't come back. Sarah nodded. But they might. The wind slid through the grass with a long whisper. Thomas turned toward the barn. Time to finish what Jacob started. Sarah followed him across the yard. Their boots pressed through the frozen mud. The barn door groaned open. Warm hay smell wrapped around them again. The mare lifted her head. Her ears flicked forward. Thomas pulled the saddle from the peg. Leather creaked softly. He laid it across the workbench beneath the lantern. The brand burned into the skirt caught the light. Sarah touched it with her fingertips. Jacob spent hours working that iron. Thomas slid the awl beneath the lining again. The seam lifted slowly. Paper crackled faintly inside. He pulled the folded document free. The same sheet Crowley had snatched the night before. But this time Thomas opened it fully. Lantern light spilled across faded ink. County seal pressed deep into the corner. Sarah leaned closer. Her breath caught. What is it? Thomas read the heading slowly. Mercer land deed. Sarah's hand rose to her mouth. But Crowley said Jacob owed debts. Thomas scanned the lines again. Jacob transferred ownership before he rode south. Sarah blinked. To who? Thomas turned the paper toward her. Her name waited there in careful script. Sarah Mercer. She stared at it. The barn seemed to hold its breath. You mean, this ranch was mine all along? Thomas nodded. Legally recorded 3 days before Jacob disappeared. Sarah sank onto a crate beside the bench. The wood creaked beneath her weight. But why hide it in the saddle? Thomas studied the brand again. Because Jacob knew Crowley would try something. Sarah's eyes moved across the paper. The ink lines. The signatures. The seal. But Crowley had another document. Thomas nodded slowly. Probably forged. Outside, the wind rattled the barn door. The sound broke the quiet. Sarah looked up suddenly. Then why did Jacob ride south? Thomas folded the paper carefully. He rested his hands on the saddle. Maybe he went to file copies. Sarah shook her head slowly. They found his coat by the ravine. Thomas said nothing. But his eyes drifted to the saddle again. To the brand. The deep iron scour. Something still bothered him. He ran his thumb along the mark. The edges were uneven. Like the iron had been struck twice. Thomas turned the saddle slightly in the light. Sarah watched him. What is it now? Thomas pressed the leather beside the brand. Another seam appeared. Smaller. Hidden beneath the scour. The awl slipped beneath it carefully. Leather cracked open again. Inside the lining, something small dropped onto the bench. A metal object. It rang softly against the wood. Clink. Sarah leaned closer. Thomas picked it up. A sheriff's badge. Old. Scratched. But the name remained clear. Jacob Mercer. Sarah blinked in disbelief. Jacob was a deputy? Thomas nodded slowly. Looks that way. He turned the badge over. Another mark scratched into the back. Crowley. Sarah's breath trembled. You think Jacob found something on him? Thomas slid the badge into his palm. Maybe Jacob learned how Crowley steals land. Sarah stared toward the barn door. If Crowley knows this badge exists. Thomas finished the thought. He'll ride back. The wind pushed the door open slightly. Cold air slipped inside. The mare stamped once. The sound echoed through the barn. Sarah folded her arms around herself. Jacob hid the truth in the saddle. Thomas tucked the badge and the deed safely into his coat. He left a trail. Sarah looked toward the yard. The sun was rising higher now. Gold light touching the fence lines. Warmth beginning to creep across the ground. But the road still waited beyond the ridge. And Crowley still believed this ranch belonged to him. Thomas hung the saddle back on the peg. Leather creaked softly. The mare snorted again. Alive. Safe. For now. Sarah stepped beside Thomas. Her voice steadier now. If Jacob died protecting this land. Thomas looked toward the road one more time. Then we finish what he started. Outside, the thaw wind returned. The frozen ground would not hold forever. And when the valley warmed again, the fight Crowley began would finally come to its end. Spring arrived slowly across the Mercer ranch. The last frost melted from the fence wire. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin roof in slow silver drops. Thomas Hale leaned against the porch rail, watching the pasture turn green again. The wind no longer carried winter's bite. It moved warm through the grass. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Sarah Mercer stepped out with 2 tin cups. Steam rose from both. Coffee again. She handed one to him. Their fingers brushed. Warm skin. Sunlight across the porch boards. Thomas took a slow drink. The coffee tasted stronger these days. Sarah leaned beside him. Judge rode through yesterday. Thomas nodded. I saw the dust. Her eyes drifted toward the road. He read the deed. The word deed settled in the quiet morning air. Thomas waited. Sarah smiled faintly. Crowley didn't say much after that. Thomas imagined the moment easily. The county seal. The signatures. The truth Jacob Mercer had buried inside that saddle. Sarah continued softly. The judge said the ranch is mine. Thomas nodded once. It always was. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods near the creek. Leaves whispered together. The sound felt peaceful now. But somewhere deep inside Thomas the memory of Crowley's threat still lingered. This isn't finished. He glanced toward the road again. Old habits. Old caution. Sarah noticed. He won't come back. Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead he watched the pasture where the mare grazed. The horse had grown strong again. Her coat shone in the sunlight. The saddle rested across the fence rail nearby. Leather warmed in the sun. The brand still marked the skirt. A scar that had once carried danger. Now it carried truth. Sarah followed his gaze. She saved everything. Thomas smiled slightly. Horse just walked home. Sarah laughed softly. The sound rolled easy across the yard. For a moment the ranch felt like a place meant for laughter again. Inside the barn a hammer rang suddenly. Clang. Clang. Thomas glanced toward the sound. A young ranch hand stepped out of the barn carrying a board. Eli Carter. 17. Strong arms. Still learning the trade. He waved awkwardly. Fence lines finished. Sarah called back. Good work. The boy grinned and disappeared behind the barn again. The ranch was growing. New hands. New life. New noise. Thomas rested his elbows on the rail. You're building it back. Sarah nodded. Jacob always wanted that pasture open. She pointed toward the far meadow. Grass grows thick there now. Thomas studied the land. Sunlight stretching across the valley. A place that once looked lonely. Now it looked alive. Sarah's voice softened. You could stay. Thomas turned his cup slowly in his hands. Warm metal. Familiar weight. I was passing through. You've been passing through 3 weeks. The wind carried the soft creak of saddle leather. The mare wandered closer to the fence. Her hooves thudded gently in the grass. Thomas listened to that sound. Once it had echoed across a frozen creek. Cold. Dangerous. Now it sounded different. Steady. Safe. Sarah leaned against the rail beside him. You don't have to keep riding. Thomas looked out across the land again. Fence posts standing straight. Smoke rising from the chimney. The barn door open wide. Life filling the quiet spaces. Still. A small tension remained. The memory of Crowley's riders. The way dust had risen on the ridge. Thomas finally spoke. Men like Crowley don't forget. Sarah nodded slowly. But they learn. Thomas looked down the road once more. Empty. Peaceful. The valley had changed. The law had spoken. Crowley's power had cracked like thawing ice. And sometimes that was enough. The mare stepped up to the fence rail. Her saddle shifted slightly. Leather creaked softly in the sunlight. The same quiet sound that once echoed in the frozen creek. Now it carried warmth instead of warning. Sarah heard it too. She smiled. That sound means something different now. Thomas nodded. Means she's home. Sarah looked at him. And maybe you are too. The wind moved through the cottonwoods again. Warm. Bright. Thomas lifted the cup and took another slow drink. The valley stretched wide and peaceful beyond the ranch. For the first time in a long while, the road did not seem to be calling him away. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again. Friend. Keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.